you're a therapist, an EMDR therapist or a trauma therapist, or a sort of general mental health counselor, you would have heard this concept of parts work. And you might be wondering, well, why do I need parts work? I've already got an amazing modality, or I'm already trained in other things. So what's parts work going to add to my work? Parts work is such a fundamental part of my practice. I'm an EMDR therapist, and I'm also trained in advanced parts work or resource therapy, which is a similar therapeutic modality to some other parts work therapies you might be familiar with already. And the purpose is to return the sort of the elements of personality, or the parts of personality, the resources, back to a healthy state, because for some reason, somewhere along the way, these parts became traumatized or in some way experienced something really tricky, and now the person is finding in their everyday life that they can't move on from that. They're almost going back into this default threat response, or default fight or flight or freeze response, or things are showing up for them that are not matching how they want to be living their everyday life. You would have probably also noted that PTSD can often be targeted very well with a standard protocol in whatever modality that you're working with. However, when we're talking about sort of complex trauma, developmental trauma, attachment-based trauma, sometimes it just doesn't feel like enough to desensitize or, restructure cognitions to sort of help that person move that trauma out of their body, out of their nervous system. We can get to an extent, but we can't always kind of resolve everything. When there's a lot of wounding there's a lot of, it feels like younger parts of self are still holding onto trauma or feeling damaged in some way. It complements beautifully with something like EMDR, where you might be going along processing what seems like an incident or a series of incidents that the person has come to see you about in perhaps more recent times. And in the work that you're doing, you're noticing that it keeps sort of flicking back to earlier periods of their life where they're developing these beliefs about themselves, about the world as being safe or unsafe. And something's just not quite shifting, because the parts that the person that is showing up, the parts reporting what is going on in their life, is sort of saying one thing, but there's this suggestion that perhaps there's earlier life trauma that's not quite being addressed or not quite shifting for them in order to move on or move towards their goals.